Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet suffering hidden behind stone walls, the kind of cold that no fire could ever chase away. Stories of grand castles often shimmer with tales of feasts and glory, yet beneath those high ceilings and painted halls, something far more human lingered, the slow, silent battle against winter itself. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights and imagine the sound of the wind curling through frozen corridors as we step quietly into the long, sleepless night inside a medieval castle, a place where warmth was a luxury and survival was never guaranteed. The last light of day slips quietly behind the distant hills, leaving the castle in a pale and colourless silence. Snow rests heavy on its roofs, softening the sharp lines of the towers and battlements until the whole structure seems half asleep beneath the weight of winter. You can almost hear the stillness, the slow exhale of the cold as it settles in for the night. Inside, a few servants move through the great hall, their footsteps muffled by the rushes scattered across the floor. They carry bundles of kindling, small armfuls of wood that will be gone before midnight. The fire burns low in the hearth, its orange light trembling against the stone walls. Each flicker reveals how vast, how empty the room truly is. For a moment, it almost feels like the flames themselves are shivering. Beyond the windows, the wind begins to rise. It scrapes softly against the shutters, whistling through gaps in the iron hinges. The sound is lonely, not angry, not violent, but patient. The kind of sound that could go on forever. Those who live here have learned not to fear it. They simply listen, waiting for the moment when it fades, though it never really does. In the corner, a single candle stands on the edge of a wooden table, its wax pooling slowly, inch by inch. The light trembles with every breath of air. One of the servants, a boy no older than 12, watches the wax drip and harden. He does this every night, without really knowing why. Perhaps he finds comfort in the repetition. Perhaps he counts the drops as a way to measure how long the night will last. There is a heaviness in the air that isn't just cold. It's the awareness of the stone itself, these thick, unyielding walls that have outlived their builders. The castle doesn't feel like shelter. It feels like something old and indifferent, a thing that endures rather than protects. You can almost imagine it breathing in slow, cold drafts, exhaling faint clouds of dust from between its stones. In the upper chambers, the Lord's family prepares for the evening. They move slowly, wrapping layers of wool and fur around themselves, trying to trap whatever warmth the day has left. The servants bring in warmed stones wrapped in cloth to place beneath the bedding, though everyone knows the heat will fade before midnight. The air smells faintly of smoke and damp wool. Even in comfort, the night promises no ease. Outside the walls, darkness has swallowed the fields and forests. The torches along the battlements are little more than dim points in the void, bending weakly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a single crow calls out before the cold silences it. There are no stars tonight, just a low ceiling of cloud that presses down upon the land like a lid. You can't tell where the snow ends and the sky begins. Back in the hall, the boy has finished stacking the wood. He kneels beside the hearth, trying to coax the flame higher. Sparks dance for a moment, then fade. He sighs, pulls his thin cloak tighter, and glances toward the far end of the room where a heavy door leads into the corridor. For some reason, he hesitates before standing. The corridor beyond is dark, the kind of dark that looks thicker than air. Sometimes, late at night, he swears he can hear faint tapping sounds there like footsteps. Too light to belong to anyone real, he tells no one. No one would believe him, and besides, there's no reason to. Old castles make strange noises, The wood expands, the stone cracks, the wind plays tricks. That's what the older servants say. Still, every evening, as the last light fades and the fires grow dim, he feels that same quiet unease creeping up from the cold floor. It isn't fear, exactly more like the sense that the castle remembers things, and sometimes it wants to be heard. Further up, the chapel bell rings once. The sound rolls through the corridors like a sigh. The servants pause, murmuring a short prayer before continuing their rhyme. The work. The sound lingers, hanging in the air long after the bell has stopped. Then, only silence again, a silence so deep it feels like part of the architecture. The great hall begins to empty as the night deepens. The last servant leaves, carrying a bucket of ashes from the hearth. The door shuts behind him with a low wooden groan. For a while, the only movement in the room is the slow flicker of the dying fire. Shadows stretch across the walls, long and uneven. The carved faces on the old wooden beams seem to move as the flames twist below them, their expressions shifting between calm and sorrow. If you listen closely, you can almost hear something beneath the sound of the wind, a faint rhythm, like breathing, not ghostly, not frightening, just the quiet life of the building itself, the slow settling of stone upon stone. It's been doing this for centuries, through countless winters. The castle has learned patience. It knows that everything, even the harshest cold, eventually fades. But the boy at the hearth doesn't know this kind of patience yet. He's young, and winter still feels endless. He finishes his duties and finally dares to walk down the dark corridor, his candle throwing a weak circle of light ahead of him. The air grows colder with every step. The walls sweat with condensation. Somewhere above, water drips from a crack in the ceiling, echoing in slow, deliberate drops. 1, 2, 3, then silence again. He stops at a corner and looks down the next hall. It's empty, or at least, it seems to be. There's an old tapestry there, depicting a long-forgotten hunt, its colours faded almost to grey. When the candlelight flickers, the hounds on the fabric seem to move, their stitched bodies twisting just slightly, as though still chasing something through time. He blinks, and they're still again. He exhales, but his breath turns to mist before his face. A draught passes, carrying the smell of stone dust and old fabric. He thinks he hears a whisper too soft to be a voice, but not quite the sound of wind either. He listens. Nothing follows. The candle's flame bends sharply to one side, then steadies. He takes one last look at the tapestry, then continues on his way. When he's gone, the air behind him still stirs, as if the corridor hasn't quite accepted his absence. Outside, the snow begins to fall again. It comes gently at first, in slow spirals that drift against the windows and vanish, then thicker, heavier, until the world is once more blank and weightless. The castle settles further into its own stillness. No sound but the low moan of wind around its towers. No movement but the faint, rhythmic dance of firelight against the stone. The boy finally reaches his sleeping quarters, a small room near the servants' hall, barely more than a cell. He sets the candle down and closes the wooden door behind him. The air smells faintly of straw and old linen. He crawls onto his bed and pulls the blanket tight around his shoulders. His breath fogs the air again. For a while, he listens to the wind and the muffled creak of timbers. Then, somewhere deep within the castle, a door closes by itself. Or maybe it's just the cold shifting the wood. He tells himself that, anyway. In another part of the castle, far above him, the Lord lies awake in his curtained bed, listening to the same wind. He hears the same faint door sound and wonders if it came from the chapel. He'll ask the servants in the morning, though he already knows they'll shrug and say it was nothing. In this place, nothing is ever quite nothing, just the echo of life persisting through the cold. And as the night takes its first deep breath, The last warmth of the day vanishes from the air. The castle exhales, settling into its long vigil. Outside, the snow falls heavier, covering everything in silence. Inside, the last ember in the hearth dims to black. The boy dreams of summer fields he'll never see again. And somewhere, faintly, the old stones remember one more night of enduring the winter. The cold will keep its stories safe until morning. The night deepens, and with it, the castle's silence grows heavier. It's the kind of silence that doesn't simply fill the space, it becomes part of it. You can almost feel it pressing softly against your skin, wrapping itself around every sound until even the smallest movement seems loud enough to echo through centuries. The stone walls, thick and ancient, are the keepers of that silence. They hold it like breath. If you were to walk through the great hall now, you would notice how sound behaves differently here. Your footsteps don't really echo, they dissolve, as if the air itself swallows them. The cold is sharper too, clinging to every surface, radiating outward from the stone as though the castle itself is made of frozen time. The torches along the corridor flicker, their flames struggling to stay alive, their faint smoke curling lazily toward the vaulted ceiling before disappearing into darkness. In one corner, a tapestry stirs ever so slightly, though there's no visible draught. Beneath it lies a narrow gap in the wall, not a passage, just a place where the stone has shifted over the years. The air that seeps through it smells faintly metallic, like damp iron. Some say that during winter, when the frost settles deepest, the castle exhales through its cracks, an old, cold breath carrying whispers from centuries past. It's easy to dismiss that as imagination, but if you stood here long enough, you might begin to wonder whether the walls themselves remember the people who once leaned against them, the hands that built them, the voices that prayed beside them. In another part of the castle, a guard walks his rounds. His breath drifts before him in soft clouds. The iron of his helmet is slick with condensation. Each time he passes a window slit, a thread of icy air snakes in and touches his cheek. He doesn't hurry. There's nowhere to hurry to. His torchlight trembles on the walls, revealing carvings so old their meanings have long been forgotten. Patterns of vines, strange animals, a few faces that seem too human to be purely decorative. He never looks at them for long. Something about their eyes, carved and still, gives him the uneasy feeling that they're looking back. He stops by a staircase and listens. There's nothing, just the weight of the night. And yet, he could swear he heard something moments ago, a faint scraping, like fabric brushing against stone. He waits. The sound doesn't return. When he finally moves on, his boots make that soft crunch against the rushes, the only reminder that someone still walks these halls. Behind him, the stone stays motionless, but the cold lingers a little longer, as though it's been watching. In the great hall below, the ashes in the hearth glow faintly. Every so often, a spark leaps out and dies mid-air. The carved beams above creak softly, adjusting to the temperature. It's an old sound, one the servants barely notice anymore. But tonight it feels louder, deeper. The entire hall seems to breathe in rhythm with the shifting of the beams. There's something strangely alive in the stillness. Not menacing, not ghostly, but watchful. Patient, as though the castle is listening to itself exist. If you touch the wall, you'll notice how damp it feels. The cold seeps through it, carrying the scent of earth and age. The stones were quarried centuries ago, each one placed by hand, bound with lime and prayer. And somehow, through storms and sieges and winters beyond count, they've stayed here, unmoving. But every winter, the frost pushes a little deeper, and the mortar cracks just a little more. The castle doesn't resist, it endures. The way a mountain endures, the way silence endures. In the kitchens, a single ember still glows beneath the ashes of the great oven. The air smells faintly of bread long eaten. and smoke long gone cold. A thin trail of steam rises from a wooden bucket near the wall, water brought in hours ago, now half frozen at the edges. Somewhere above, a drip of melted frost falls from the ceiling, striking the surface with a soft, deliberate sound. Each drop seems to mark the slow passing of time, counting the hours until morning. It's said that in castles like these, when the cold was at its harshest, people sometimes imagined hearing voices in the stone. Not whispers exactly, but faint tones, low, distant and resonant, like someone humming far below the earth. It was just the wind, of course, slipping through gaps and hollows, turning the building itself into an instrument. But when you've been awake too long, when the fire is gone and the night has swallowed everything else, even the sound of wind can begin to feel like a memory. The guard finishes his round and descends into the lower hall, his torch burning smaller now. The flame reflects in the iron sconces, then fades as he passes. When he reaches the bottom, he pauses again. There's that same faint scraping sound, this time behind him. He turns, slowly, raising the torch. Nothing. Just the tapestry, moving slightly, though the air is still. He takes a step closer, the fabric sways, settles. Behind it, only the wall dark, uneven, ancient. He laughs softly to himself, though it sounds more like an exhale than amusement, and continues on. Behind the tapestry, the wall remains still, yet for a moment after he leaves, there's a soft shift in the stones, like something settling back into place. Up above, the lord of the castle stirs in his bed. The cold has crept beneath his blankets. He wakes briefly, not from fear but from discomfort, and stares at the canopy above him. The shadows from the fire dance across the curtains, shaping themselves into forms that look almost familiar, outlines of figures he might have known once or dreamed of knowing. He blinks, and they're gone. He turns on his side and listens to the quiet. Somewhere far away, the chapel bell stirs faintly in the wind, though no one has touched it. The silence returns, deeper now. The castle holds it like a secret. The stones don't speak, yet their presence feels almost conversational, a dialogue between centuries. You can sense the weight of time in them, the layers of life that have passed through. Every winter, every voice, every footstep is still here in some invisible form, suspended within the cold. If you could listen long enough, perhaps you could hear it all: the murmured prayers, the laughter, the coughing of fires gone wrong, the soft weeping of servants too tired to hope for spring. But no one listens that long. The cold makes sure of that. It seeps into the bones until thought itself slows, until sound loses meaning. The guard will return to his post by the gate. The servants will curl into their straw beds, and the lord will dream uneasy dreams. The castle will remain awake, vast and indifferent, keeping its vigil through the small hours. If you stood outside now, beneath the curtain of snow, and looked up at the castle, you'd see a few faint lights, the last of the torches dying along the walls. You'd hear almost nothing. Maybe the distant clink of a chain, the moan of wind threading through the battlements. But if you stayed long enough, you might notice something else, a rhythm so subtle it's almost impossible to catch. Not quite the wind, not quite the creak of wood, more like a low heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing from deep within the stone. No one inside would notice it. They're used to the castle's strange sounds. They've learned to live beside them. But the walls remember. They remember the builders who shaped them, the winters they endured, the silence they have kept for generations. Every sigh of wind through the corridors, every faint scrape in the dark, all of it is part of the same long story, whispered back and forth between the stones and the cold. The night continues, hour by hour, without hurry, without warmth. The torches die, one by one, and the darkness grows complete. Somewhere in the hall, a single ember still glows, It's small, fragile, almost gone. And yet, as the wind moves through the tower, that tiny light flickers once more, not brighter, just enough to show that something inside the stone is still awake, still listening, still waiting for morning to arrive. The fire has long since dimmed to a quiet red glow, its warmth fading in hesitant waves that barely touch the far corners of the room. The air grows heavier, colder, the kind of cold that seeps not only through skin but through thought. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, the night moans like a wounded creature, the wind searching for every crack, every small mercy in the stone. You might pull your cloak tighter, but it does little. The cold has a way of ignoring fabric, ignoring will. It moves as it pleases, quietly and without hurry. Inside a medieval castle, warmth was never a constant companion. It was something chased, bargained for, and often lost. The great hearths that burned in the main halls could offer some comfort, but they were like brief flickers of life in a vast ocean of chill. The heat would rise toward the rafters, leaving the floors beneath coated with frost. Those closest to the fire often sweated, while those just a few steps away could feel their fingers stiffen from the cold. And yet, everyone stayed close, pretending not to notice how the smoke gathered above them, curling into the air like slow-moving spirits. The servants would take turns tending to the fire, feeding it logs so heavy they could scarcely lift them. But the wood was always damp in winter, and the smoke stung the eyes. Still, the alternative was far worse. Without constant feeding, the fire would die, and with it, the fragile illusion of warmth that kept the castle alive through the night. In their chambers, nobles might have small fireplaces of their own. They would fill them with peat or small branches, the flames licking softly against the blackened stone. Yet even then, the warmth never lasted. It was said that you could tell a true winter's night by how far the frost crept across your walls like slow white vines marking the hours until dawn. The richer folk wrapped themselves in layers of wool and fur, but the cold was a patient visitor. It didn't rush, it simply waited until everything grew still, and then it came closer. Down in the servants' quarters, the air was worse. No fireplaces, no fine furs, just straw and shared breath. Bodies huddled close beneath thin blankets, hoping that their combined warmth would be enough to trick the night. The straw crackled softly beneath them, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and tallow candles. Some whispered quiet prayers before sleep, asking for the night to pass quickly, though most knew it never did. Time itself seemed to slow in the cold, each hour stretching longer than it should. There's something strangely human about the endless struggle for warmth. It's not just a fight against temperature, but against silence, against the vastness of dark. The cold reminds us of how small we really are, and how fragile our comforts can be. It strips everything away: luxury, pride, noise, until only the body remains, curled and trembling in the dark. Sometimes, people spoke of strange things happening on the coldest nights. When the air grew so still that even breath felt heavy, they claimed to hear whispers in the corridors, not voices of the living, but echoes of those who had once fought the same battle. A kitchen maid might wake suddenly and swear she saw someone standing by the hearth, feeding an invisible fire. A guard on the walls might glimpse a shadow moving slowly along the battlements, as though searching for a warmth that no longer existed. Whether real or imagined, such stories travelled quietly through the castle, giving shape to the loneliness that winter always brought. Animals, too, felt the weight of the season. The hounds curled up together in the kennels, their breath rising like mist in the torchlight. Horses shivered in their stalls, their hooves shifting restlessly on the frozen straw. Sometimes a servant would sneak down at night to check on them, brushing frost from their coats and whispering softly, not for the animals' comfort, but their own. The beasts, at least, didn't pretend, they simply endured. Food, too, became part of the struggle for warmth. The kitchens worked through the night, not just to prepare meals, but to keep the fires alive. Pots of broth simmered endlessly, filling the air with the scent of onions, smoke, and boiling fat. People drank hot ale or watered wine, not for pleasure but survival, anything to bring a momentary illusion of heat. The poor servants would cup their hands around their mugs, holding on as long as possible before the warmth faded away. Even the walls seemed to react to the cold. At night, you could hear faint cracks echoing through the stone as it expanded and contracted. Some said it sounded like the castle sighing, as if it too were alive, trying to survive the long winter beside its inhabitants. Others believed it was the sound of something older, something buried deep within the stone, reminding them that the castle was built not just from rock, but from time itself. In the great hall, the tapestries hung stiff and lifeless, their colours dulled by the frost. The candles burned unevenly, their wax dripping in slow, deliberate trails. Every breath clouded the air, turning even conversation into something visible, fleeting. People spoke less as the night went on, not out of discipline, but because the cold seemed to swallow sound. Words simply fell away, lost in the stillness. What's strange is how quickly the mind adapts. After a while, the cold becomes a companion of sorts, something known, something expected. People learn to move slower, to waste less energy. Every motion became deliberate, every sound muffled. Even thought seemed to quiet down, turning inward. Perhaps that's why winter in a medieval castle felt both suffocating and sacred. It forced stillness upon everyone, a kind of reluctant meditation in stone. There's a story, likely exaggerated, though not entirely unbelievable, of a noblewoman who claimed she could hear the walls breathe on the coldest nights. She said it was like listening to the castle dream. Her maids laughed, but not too loudly, afraid perhaps that the walls might hear. Such fancies weren't uncommon. The longer one lived inside stone, the more alive it seemed to become. And maybe, on nights when the cold wrapped tightly around the world, the boundaries between imagination and memory grew thin. Some nights, the castle would seem utterly frozen, time suspended like frost on the windows. Then, suddenly, the fire would crackle a sharp pop, breaking the silence, and everyone would exhale, reminded for a moment that they were still among the living. A small ember glowing in the darkness was enough to keep hope alive. Yet hope was fragile, like the fire itself. It demanded attention, care, and constant feeding. The people of the castle learned that lesson each winter, that warmth wasn't something you simply had, it was something you maintained, something you earned, hour by hour, log by log, breath by breath. And so, through the long frozen night, they kept moving. Someone always awake, tending to the fire, walking the halls, checking the doors. The cold was relentless, but so was the quiet rhythm of survival. You could almost say the two belonged to each other, the cold and the living, locked in an ancient, unending conversation. If you were there, standing in that dim firelight, you might notice the faint sound of wood shifting in the hearth, or the gentle sigh of someone dreaming nearby. And for a moment, despite the cold, despite the endless dark, you'd understand the strange beauty of it all, how even in the harshest chill, there's a quiet defiance that keeps the night alive. The castle sleeps, or at least pretends to. The lords and ladies have long since retreated behind heavy doors, their chambers faintly glowing with the last flicker of dying embers. But beneath them, far below the carved ceilings and painted walls, the real life of the night continues. The servants' night is a world apart, quieter, colder, and far more human. It begins when the great hall grows still, when the torches are dimmed and the echo of footsteps fades into silence. Down in the lower corridors, the air feels thick with soot and frost. The stones hold the cold like a secret. Every breath hangs in front of you, a pale mist that disappears before you can see where it goes. Servants move carefully, wrapped in wool so coarse it scratches their skin, their feet muffled by straw scattered along the floors to catch the dirt of the day. There is no luxury here, only the rhythm of survival, quiet, patient, and endless. Most of them sleep in small shared quarters, low-ceilinged rooms where the walls sweat with condensation and the air smells faintly of smoke and damp linen. They lie close together on rough mattresses stuffed with straw, not for comfort, but for warmth. Sometimes, in the darkness, one can hear the faint rustle of movement, a cough, a shiver, a whispered word. It is a fragile kind of rest, the kind that comes not from peace but from exhaustion. The night watchman makes his slow rounds, carrying a small lantern that paints long shadows across the stone. He pauses sometimes, listening to the faint moan of wind through the passageways. It sounds almost alive, not angry, not kind, just endlessly present. The watchman knows better than to speak to it. He simply keeps walking, the flame trembling in his hand like a heartbeat. In the kitchens, a few figures still linger. A pot of broth simmers quietly on the hearth, not for the nobles but for those who must rise before dawn. The fire here is small but precious. Servants gather around it, their faces soft in the amber light, their hands stretched out in silence. Someone peels a potato slowly, just for something to do. Someone else hums an old song under their breath, not a cheerful tune, but one that carries the strange comfort of familiarity, the kind of song that belongs to the night. If you listen closely, you might hear something else beneath the hum of the fire, a faint tapping, like footsteps where no one walks. The servants have stories about that. They say the castle remembers everyone who ever served within it, that their footsteps never quite fade, but wander still, searching for warmth they once knew. Some servants laugh it off, others quietly make the sign of the cross, but all of them, when the wind is just right, pause to listen. A boy sleeps in the corner of the kitchen, wrapped in a threadbare cloak. He's no older than 12, a scullion who tends the fires and carries water. His hands are cracked, his nails blackened with soot. He dreams, perhaps, of sunlight, though he hasn't seen much of it in months. In his sleep, his lips move slightly, as if whispering to someone who isn't there. The cook glances over, shakes her head gently, and covers him with another scrap of cloth. She's seen too many winters to find it strange. Outside, in the courtyard, frost forms delicate patterns along the stone. The moonlight turns everything silver. Somewhere, a dog barks once and then stops, as if even sound is afraid to linger too long. The stables creak faintly in the wind, and the horses shift, their breath rising like steam. A stable hand, too cold to sleep, sits by the door, carving something from a piece of wood. His knife moves slowly, the rhythm hypnotic. When asked what he's carving, he says it's just a spoon, but it looks more like a face. Time moves differently for the servants. While the nobles dream beneath heavy blankets, those below count the night in tasks, not hours. Stoke the fire, fetch the water, check the gates, listen for rats. The work never truly ends, only slows. And yet, there's something almost sacred about their routine. It binds them together in a way that titles and riches never could. In the cold, everyone is the same: bones, breath, and the quiet need to endure. Sometimes, when the night grows too long, the servants speak softly to one another, their words like warm pockets of air. They talk about small things, a candle that burned strangely, a rumour about the Lord's mood, a dream someone had of a summer that may or may not return. One girl claims she once saw a figure standing at the top of the staircase, wrapped in fur, staring down at her without eyes. The others tell her to hush, but no one laughs. Not here, not in winter. Every now and then, a faint scent drifts through the air. Lavender, maybe, or something sweeter. No one knows where it comes from. Some say it's from the ladies' chambers. Others that it belongs to someone who never left the castle at all. The smell is gone as quickly as it arrives, leaving behind only questions. The servants grow quiet again, each secretly wondering whether they're truly alone. In the laundry room, water sits frozen in wooden tubs. Someone forgot to empty them before nightfall. A maid breaks the ice with a poker, just to hear the sound. It echoes like glass through the hall. She smiles faintly, as though she's heard a friend speak. The sound of breaking ice has its own kind of beauty, sharp, clean, and fleeting. For a moment, it makes the world feel alive again. By midnight, even the fires have grown tired. The kitchen hearth sputters low, the last logs collapsing into glowing dust. The servants retreat to Blondbow, their beds of straw and cloth curling into themselves, breathing slow. Outside, the wind whispers against the shutters, testing them. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of smoke and sleep. The castle breathes slow, steady, ancient, and then, for a brief moment, everything seems to stop. The fire stops crackling. The wind goes still. The only sound left is the faint rhythm of breathing dozens of soft, uneven breaths rising and falling in the dark. It feels like the entire castle is listening, waiting for something to pass unseen. There's a strange peace in that silence, a moment where even the cold seems to hesitate. If you were standing there, watching them, the servants asleep in their narrow beds, the embers pulsing faintly like stars, you might understand something they never said aloud, that their quiet endurance, their small, unseen lives, are what truly kept the castle alive through winter. Not the grandeur of the halls, nor the power of the lords, but the warmth shared between those who had almost nothing. And perhaps that's why, centuries later, when the wind passes through the ruins of old castles, it sounds almost like breathing slow, careful, and human, as if the servants' night never really ended, but lingers still, repeating itself softly beneath the stone. The Lord's chamber sits at the heart of the castle, not for warmth, but for protection. Its walls are thick, its windows narrow, and its silence almost deliberate. The fire burns steadily here, fed by servants who slip in and out like ghosts. And yet, even with the flames rising tall, there's a certain chill that never leaves. The kind that hides in corners, beneath tapestries, behind carved oak panels, the kind that watches and waits. The chamber itself smells faintly of smoke and beeswax, with just a hint of damp stone beneath. The rugs on the floor, once vivid with colour, have grown muted by years of ash and dust. The air is heavy, as if it remembers too. Much arguments, prayers, quiet regrets whispered in the dark. It's the sort of room that feels alive in its stillness, like it's listening. The Lord sits by the fire, a figure wrapped in layers of fur and velvet, his face half lit by the flickering glow. In his hand, a cup of spiced wine trembles slightly, the steam curling upward in slow, deliberate shapes. Outside his door, the rest of the castle sleeps, but inside this room, wakefulness lingers. The winter does that. It makes the nights longer than they should be, stretching thought until it begins to wander into strange places. He stares at the flames, not really seeing them. They move like memories rising, falling, devouring. Sometimes he imagines faces in the fire, people he's forgotten or tried to, servants who froze one winter when the stores ran low, soldiers lost to storms, a wife buried too young. The castle remembers them all, he thinks. It holds on to their warmth long after the bodies are gone. He wonders, not for the first time, if the walls can feel the weight of every winter that's passed within them. Some say the Lord's chamber was built on top of something older, a foundation from another time, when the land belonged to someone else entirely. In the dead of night, when the wind dies and even the fire seems to listen, faint sounds rise from beneath the floor. A creak, a sigh. Once, a servant claimed to have heard whispers through the stones, not words, exactly, but something shaped like thought. She was dismissed the next day, though no one denied what she'd said. The Lord adjusts the fur around his shoulders and turns his gaze toward the window. Beyond the narrow slit of glass, the world is frozen in silence. The moon casts a pale line across the snow, and for a moment, the castle looks like a ship adrift on a sea of ice. Somewhere, an owl cries a hollow sound that seems to stretch the distance between things. He listens to it fade, then disappear entirely. It's strange how loneliness feels sharper in warmth than in cold. A log shifts in the fire, sending a small storm of sparks upward. He watches them fade before they reach the ceiling. Everything beautiful in winter seems to vanish too quickly. The warmth, the light, the laughter of day. Even memory feels fragile, like frost that melts the moment you try to hold it. On a small table nearby lies a book, bound in leather and worn at the edges. Its pages hold the records of seasons long gone, harvests, losses, the births and deaths of those who served. The handwriting changes across the years, though the tone remains the same. Careful, restrained, endlessly practical. Yet between the lines, something quieter lingers, fatigue, perhaps, or sorrow too small to name. The Lord reads a few lines and then stops. The words seem distant, as if written by someone else entirely. He thinks of the servants sleeping below, of the stable hands curled in straw, the cooks beside dying fires, the maids huddled together in dark rooms. They dream, he imagines, not of glory, but of sunlight. Simple things, a warm meal, a summer that never ends. For a moment, he envies them. Their world may be smaller, but perhaps it's kinder. His, in contrast, is filled with shadows that never sleep. There is a painting on the wall across from his bed, a hunting scene, filled with green forests and red hounds and bright, golden light. It looks foreign in this season, almost obscene in its warmth. He remembers the day it was painted, years ago, when the world still seemed softer. He can't recall the artist's name now, only that they died that same winter. Sometimes, when the fire flickers, the figures in the painting seem to move just slightly, as if caught between one breath and the next. He doesn't mention this to anyone. The Lord's bed stands tall, draped with heavy curtains that fall like velvet shadows. Beneath them, the air is slightly warmer, though the sheets are still cold to the touch. It takes time for the body to make its own warmth. He lies down slowly, feeling the weight of the night settle over him. The wind presses softly against the shutters, as if testing their strength. He closes his eyes, but sleep comes reluctantly, circling him like a wary animal. He dreams, perhaps, though it's hard to tell where dreaming ends and the castle begins. In the half-sleep between thoughts, he hears faint footsteps in the corridor, measured, careful, too deliberate to belong to rats. They pause outside his door. For a moment, there's silence. Then, a soft knock. Just once. Not loud, not urgent, almost polite. When he opens his eyes, there's nothing there. Only the faint hiss of wind through stone. He doesn't call for anyone. Instead, he listens. Sometimes, the castle speaks like this, through small, uncertain sounds. A reminder, perhaps, that it's alive in its own way. He wonders, who knocked? A memory? A ghost? Or simply the echo of something he's forgotten? The longer one lives within stone, the more it seems to borrow from you warmth, thought, voice, until you can no longer tell where you end and it begins. He sits up again, unable to rest. The fire has burned low, the light soft and golden. The frost on the window has grown thicker, curling into delicate patterns that look almost deliberate. He traces one with his finger, though the glass is too cold to touch for long. The world outside is nothing but white and silence. Inside, the walls seem closer than before. And then, from somewhere deep in the castle, he hears it, a sound like someone sighing. Not the wind this time, not the creak of wood. A real human sigh, low and weary, rising from the stones beneath the floor. He holds his breath and waits. It doesn't come again, but the thought of it lingers, quiet and persistent, as though the castle is reminding him of something he once promised and never kept. Eventually, he lies back, his eyes heavy. The fire gives one last soft crack before settling into embers. The room grows dim, then darker still. The warmth fades, replaced by that old, familiar chill. Yet in that cold, there's a strange comfort, as though the night itself has finally accepted him. His breath slows, matching the rhythm of the sleeping castle. Perhaps, if you were to walk through those halls now, you'd find him like that motionless, calm, half-shadow, half-memory. The Lord in his chamber, resting beneath a ceiling that listens. The fire out, the walls alive with quiet thought. And somewhere, far below, the servants begin to stir again, their world returning to motion while his fades gently into stillness. The castle breathes, as it always does, patient, watchful, unchanged. Outside, the snow continues to fall, soft as ash, covering everything it touches, erasing edges, blurring the line between warmth and cold, between the living and the remembered. And in that endless hush, the winter night goes on. Every castle has its forgotten corners, the places where light rarely reaches, and memory lingers longer than it should. These are not the grand halls or the chambers of kings, but the small, crooked spaces that exist between purpose and neglect. They are cold, quiet, and patient. Stone staircases that lead nowhere, rooms too narrow to sleep in, passages so damp that moss grows along their walls like veins. No one cleans these places. No one remembers why they were built. Yet, somehow, they remain unchanging, unclaimed, and deeply alive. If you were to walk through a medieval castle on a winter night, these forgotten corners would call to you without sound. The air there is different. Colder, yes, but also older. It feels like stepping into the breath of the past itself, where time has slowed to a crawl. Every drip of water, every shifting draft seems deliberate, as though the stones themselves are whispering in a language too slow for humans to hear. Most people avoided these spaces. Servants moved past them quickly, their candles held close, their eyes fixed on the floor. They said such corners belonged to no one. That warmth refused to stay there. A candle flame would flicker oddly near those walls, as if disturbed by invisible movement. Some called it the work of drafts. Others said it was something else, the air remembering the footsteps of those long gone. One of these corners lies beneath the east stairwell, a place known only to the oldest servants. The air smells faintly of earth, and a trickle of water runs down one wall, freezing in delicate ribbons when the temperature drops. Beneath the sound of dripping, there's something else, a faint hum, low and rhythmic, like distant breathing. When the castle is quiet enough, and the fires above have gone out, you can almost feel it vibrating through the floor. No one knows what causes it. Some say it's the sound of the castle itself, the slow shifting of ancient stone beneath the weight of centuries. Others believe it's older, something buried beneath, still dreaming. Up in the towers, there are rooms that haven't been opened in generations. Dust lies thick enough to soften every edge. Old fabrics hang limp from wooden beams, and forgotten chests rest beneath layers of frost. When the wind passes through a crack in the window, It stirs the dust into slow, spiraling clouds, catching the moonlight in ways that make the air look almost alive. There are footprints there, too small, faint, leading nowhere, perhaps left by mice, or perhaps not. Sometimes a servant, curious or unlucky, might find themselves near one of these spaces. They might pause, candle trembling, and peer into the dark. The silence feels wrong, not empty, but listening. A few steps closer, and the air grows heavier, as if pressing against the skin. There's no danger, not in the way one usually understands it, but there's something undeniable, a presence, quiet and ancient, watching from the cold. The lords and ladies rarely spoke of such places. They preferred to believe their castles were maps of order rooms for sleeping, halls for feasting, chapels for prayer, but beneath that neat design, the forgotten corners thrived, feeding on neglect. Even architects could not fully account for every corridor, every hollow wall. A castle, after all, is not just a building. It grows with time. It absorbs everything: breath, heat, grief, and hides it where no one looks. Some winter nights, faint noises echoed from those unseen rooms, a shuffle, a sigh, the sound of fabric moving. The servants called it the stirring. It always happened near dawn, when the fires were nearly dead, and the air felt like glass. The sound was never loud, never sudden, just there, persistent, deliberate. Those who heard it never went searching for its source. They simply whispered a small prayer, pulled their blankets tighter, and waited for morning. There's a story that an old mason once disappeared while repairing a cracked wall near the lower storage rooms. They found his tools the next day, laid neatly beside a candle that had burned itself out. The wall showed no sign of repair, but a new draft had appeared, colder than before. No one sealed it again. They said the castle had taken him back, reclaiming what was always its own. Whether true or not, the place where it happened remains colder than any other part of the keep. Even in summer, the stones sweat with moisture, as if remembering that night. If you were to place your hand on one of those damp walls, you'd notice something strange. The stone is not uniformly cold. There are spots, faint but noticeable, that feel warmer, almost as if something beneath is breathing against it. It's subtle, easy to dismiss, but once you've felt it, you never quite forget. It makes the air heavier, the silence thicker. It makes the castle feel awake. In some of the upper corridors, frost patterns form intricate designs along the stone. Each winter swirls, circles, and what look almost like symbols. The servants used to joke that the frost was writing something, that the castle was trying to speak in its own language of cold. Each morning, the shapes would melt, only to return again by nightfall, slightly different, as if the message was slowly changing. No one ever deciphered them. Maybe they were just coincidence, or maybe not. The forgotten corners often held the faintest echoes of sound, a distant drip, a soft tapping. Once, the muffled sound of a door closing where no door existed. The mind could play tricks in such quiet, inventing noise where none belonged. But sometimes, when 2 or 3 servants walked together, they would stop at the same moment, heads turning in the same direction, their faces pale. They heard it too. Whatever it was, it always stopped the instant someone acknowledged it. And yet, there's something strangely peaceful about these hidden places. They are not malicious, not haunting in the cruel sense of the word. They simply exist, untouched by time's noise. In their stillness lies a kind of honesty, the raw, unembellished truth of the past. The things we forget never truly disappear. They just settle into corners, waiting for quiet enough nights to remind us they're still there. Some say the castle's warmth depends on them, that for every blazing hearth, there must be a shadowed space to balance it. The forgotten corners hold the cold so that the fires can burn. They absorb what the living cannot: silence, sorrow, memory. In that sense, The castle breathes through its emptiness. Each winter, the rhythm continues: warmth and cold, sound and silence, life and its slow fading echo. If you walk alone at night, holding a small light, you might pass one of these corners without realizing it. You might feel the air shift slightly, colder for just a moment, and think nothing of it. But the castle will notice. It always does. The stone will remember your step, your warmth, the small breath you leave behind. And long after you've gone, that corner will hold the trace of it, invisible, but real, another layer added to the quiet history of the walls. Perhaps that's the secret of these old places. They never truly forget. Every sound, every warmth, every passing soul leaves something behind. And in winter, when everything slows and the fires grow small, those memories rise again, faint, cold, patient, filling the forgotten corners with life that never fully left. It isn't haunting, not really. It's simply remembering. And if you listen long enough, in the right kind of silence, you might almost hear the past breathing. There is a peculiar kind of hunger that visits a castle at midnight, not the hunger of feasts or celebration, but something quieter, lonelier. It creeps in after the fires have died and the wind presses its cold fingers against the windows. It is the kind of hunger that is not just for food, but for warmth, for comfort, for the feeling of being alive in a place where everything else seems to have gone still. In a medieval winter, this hunger was not rare. It lived in everyone, lord and servant alike, though it revealed itself in different ways. Down in the kitchens, the stone still held the memory of the evening's fire. The great hearth stood empty now, its ash pale and delicate, like the remains of something ancient. A single ember sometimes clung to life deep within the heap, glowing faintly, as if unsure whether to live or fade. The air smelled faintly of roasted meat and smoke scents that lingered long after the meal had ended. And in that silence, the castle's stomach, so to speak, seemed to sigh. Servants who worked late would sometimes steal small bites from what was left behind: a crust of bread, a bit of cheese too hardened for the lord's table, a few spoonfuls of broth gone cold. But even when their bellies were full, the hunger remained. It was not the kind that food could quiet. It came from the cold itself, from the endless reminder that the night was stronger than the body. One such servant, a young boy tasked with tending the hearths, often lingered longer than he should. His name has been lost to time, but his small acts remain whispered in the castle's memory. Each night, he would search the kitchen for the faintest scrap, anything that still smelled of life. He said he couldn't sleep without the taste of something warm in his mouth. The others laughed softly at him, calling him the night mouse, though there was a kind of tenderness in the name. He would take his crumbs, wrap them in cloth, and climb to the upper halls, where he slept beside the kindling. But one night, when the hunger returned stronger than usual, he followed it farther than before through the lower passages, past the storage cellars, into a part of the castle no one used anymore. The cold there was different, dense, heavy, like air trapped for centuries. He swore he smelled something cooking, not the faint trace of yesterday's stew, but something fresh, rich, almost sweet. It was impossible, of course, but hunger has a way of convincing the mind of strange things. He followed the scent down a long, narrow corridor that led nowhere on the castle's maps. At the end of it stood a door, small and half sunken into the wall. He pushed it gently, and it opened without sound. Inside was only darkness, but the smell was stronger now, warm, inviting, wrong. He thought he saw the faintest glow, like a fire burning behind the wall. He took a step forward, then another. The cold disappeared for a moment, replaced by something that felt almost like heat, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. The room was empty, the smell had vanished, only the draft remained, sharp and biting. When he returned to his cot, he found his crumbs gone. He searched for them, thinking perhaps he had dropped them on the way, but they were nowhere. In the morning, he told no one, But the next night, the hunger came again, and again he followed it always to the same place, always finding nothing but cold. In time, the others began to notice his unease. His hands trembled even near the fire. He grew thinner, though he claimed to eat each day. When asked, he said only that the castle was feeding on something, though he couldn't say what. No one believed him, but they began to avoid the lower passages at night. They said the air there made you feel watched not by eyes, but by need itself. In truth, hunger was everywhere that winter. The lords had meat and wine, but even they complained of a kind of emptiness they couldn't explain. Meals felt duller, warmth less comforting. It was as though the castle itself was swallowing every satisfaction before it could reach them. Some thought it was the cold playing tricks. Others whispered that something beneath the stone had awakened, something that lived off the longing of the living. It was an old belief, one mostly forgotten by then, that certain places could grow hungry, just as men do. They said that walls, if built upon enough sorrow or silence, could begin to crave the life that moved within them. The castle, in that way, was a living thing, not with breath, but with need. And, during the long winters, when every sound was muffled by frost and every light struggled to survive, its hunger deepened. Up in the Lord's chamber, even luxury could not soften the cold. The heavy curtains, the layered furs, the great bed carved with beasts all seemed powerless against the air that seeped through the stone. The Lord would sometimes wake in the night, not from dreams, but from an emptiness in his chest, as if something had drawn the warmth straight from his body. He would call for more wood, more blankets, but nothing ever lasted long. The fires died faster there than anywhere else in the castle. He once ordered a priest to bless the room, thinking it might ease the strange chill. The priest came, whispered his words, and left pale. When asked what he had seen, he said only that the place was not unholy, but hungry, a difference few understood. As the nights grew longer, the servants began leaving offerings in the kitchen before bed. Bits of bread, a spoon of porridge, a bone with a trace of meat. They said it kept the hunger quiet, that the castle ate before they slept, so it would not come looking. It might have been superstition, but the air did seem gentler on those nights. The wood cracked less, the wind sighed, rather than screamed. Yet there were still moments fleeting, unsettling, when the hunger made itself known. A loaf left on the table would vanish without trace. The scent of food would drift through the hall even when no one had cooked. In the darkest hours, a faint sound, like chewing or the clink of a spoon, could be heard echoing through the kitchen walls. Those who heard it would pull their blankets tighter, pretending not to notice. To speak of it was to invite it closer, and so the castle fed not on flesh, but on desire, on the ache of the cold, the longing for warmth, the small prayers whispered by tired servants. Each bit of yearning seemed to settle into the stone, deepening its appetite. When spring finally came and the ice began to melt, the air inside the castle softened too. But the hunger did not disappear. It merely slept, waiting for the next winter's quiet to wake it again. Even now, in some of the oldest ruins, people say the air feels strange at midnight, heavier, warmer, faintly scented with bread, long turned to dust. Travellers passing through might find their food gone by morning, though no animal tracks are found nearby. They laugh about it at first, blaming the wind, the cold, or forgetfulness. But later, when they lie awake in the stillness of night, they sometimes hear it, that soft, steady sound, deep within the stone. A sound not of footsteps, nor of ghosts, but of something very old and very patient, remembering hunger as if it were a kind of prayer. The hours before dawn in a medieval castle were unlike any other time. They existed in a quiet suspension, not night, not morning, but something in between, something that seemed to belong only to the cold itself. The fires had died to faint orange whispers. The servants had drifted into uneasy sleep, and even the wind outside seemed to have grown tired of its own voice. It was the hour when time seemed to lose interest in moving forward, and the castle, wrapped in frost and silence, simply waited. In those hours, the cold was not loud, it did not bite or howl, it simply pressed gently, endlessly through the walls, through the blankets, through the very breath of those who remained awake. To live in a castle in winter was to understand that warmth was never won. It was only borrowed, and always briefly. You could feel it leaving you even as you sat beside the fire, slipping away like memory. The servants, those who had work that stretched into the small hours, knew this best. The ones tending the fires would move from room to room with half-shut eyes, watching the glow fade behind them as they walked away. Each time, they knew the flame they left behind would not last until morning. The wood burned too quickly, the draught stole too much, and still they tried. It was less about keeping the rooms warm, and more about fighting the feeling of being forgotten by the light. One servant, an older woman named Alice, had the task of checking the Lord's hearth just before dawn. She moved like a shadow through the corridors, her steps soft against the stone, her breath visible in the dim light of her lantern. She often spoke softly to herself as she walked, not words, exactly, but little hums, as though the sound might keep her company. Some nights, she swore she heard another voice hum back, faint, distant, and not quite human. She told no one, fearing they might laugh or cross themselves and mutter about spirits. But the sound was not frightening to her. It was gentle, like an echo that simply didn't know how to stop. The walls, if they could speak, would have said the same thing. They too carried echoes, voices that had long outlasted their owners. Whispers of old conversations seemed to rest in the mortar. A laugh that had once filled the hall might still linger faintly, trapped in the air like dust. In the long hours before dawn, when the castle grew so still that even the fire seemed to listen, these sounds sometimes returned. A faint murmur in the hallway, a door creaking open though no hand touched it, the rustle of fabric where no one stood. The cold made sound behave strangely. It stretched it, carried it, distorted it, until it felt alive. Those who woke during that hour often felt disoriented. The castle, by lamplight, looked both smaller and larger. The shadows seemed to fold the corridors into impossible directions, and the air shimmered faintly as if breathing. Some said that during these hours, the boundary between the present and the past grew thin, and for a few brief moments, the castle remembered itself. The stones recalled every winter, every night spent waiting for morning. It was not a haunting, exactly more like a quiet reflection, a place thinking itself back into being. The Lord, if he happened to wake, would feel it too. Sometimes, just before dawn, he would open his eyes and see his own breath curling above him, illuminated by the faintest grey light from the window. He would listen not for sounds of danger, but for that strange stillness that filled the castle. He described it once to his scribe as the air between heartbeats. For those few hours, even fear seemed frozen. There was only waiting for the first sound of a bird, the first shimmer of light, the first relief of knowing the night was over. Yet those moments also held their own kind of peace. In the quiet, one could feel the weight of the world paused, as though every hardship and hunger was resting too. The servants spoke of it as the castle's breath, when everything exhaled before the new day began. Some would sit by the dying embers and close their eyes, not to sleep but to listen. The sound of settling ash, the creak of beams contracting in the frost, the faint drip of melting ice outside, all of it blended into something strangely soothing, a rhythm that reminded them, for a little while, that the night always ends. But there were stranger things, two things no one could quite explain. Sometimes, faint footprints appeared on the frost-covered floors of the great hall, leading nowhere and belonging to no one. They would melt away by morning, as though they had been made by something that only half existed. Once, a servant swore he saw candlelight moving behind a locked door, not the flicker of flame, but a steady glow that pulsed softly like breath. When he opened the door, there was nothing, only the smell of beeswax and the faint warmth of something that had recently been alive. The monks who visited the castle later in the century had a name for such moments. They called it times the hour of whispers, times the time before dawn, when the soul, half asleep, is still close enough to the unseen to notice its presence. They believed that the cold, rather than hiding the world's secrets, actually made them visible, that in the still air, when everything else was quiet, the boundaries between the living and the forgotten became transparent. It was, they said, the reason so many claimed to hear voices or see faint lights at that hour, not because they were dreaming, but because they were awake in a way they were not meant to be. Still, life went on. The cocks would crow, the first grey light would begin to stretch across the courtyard, and the world would remember its shape again. The servants would stir, rub their eyes, and step into their duties as if nothing strange had happened. The Lord would rise, wrapped in furs, and speak of the weather. The night silence would dissolve into the ordinary noise of living, the clang of buckets, the scrape of boots, the hum of new fires. Yet the feeling lingered, a faint chill that refused to leave entirely. For some, that hour became a sort of private ritual. They would wake intentionally, just before dawn, and sit quietly by a small flame or window, watching the slow transition from darkness to light. It was, perhaps, the only moment in the day that felt truly honest, when the world was stripped of its noise and pretense, and only breath and frost remained. A few even said that the cold carried lessons, that it reminded them how fragile warmth was, how easily it disappeared, and how precious each return of morning truly became. And so, the castle endured another winter, as it had endured so many before. The long hours before dawn stretched on, each one blending into the next, filled with soft sounds and softer silences. In those hours, the castle was not a place of power or history, but something simpler, a shelter, a sleeping body, a collection of hearts waiting for light. And as the faintest streaks of blue began to seep through the windows, the cold loosened its grip just enough to let the world breathe again. It is easy, centuries later, to think of those nights as bleak or lifeless, but there was something sacred about them too, something that modern warmth has erased. The stillness held the weight of all who had ever waited through it. And if you were to stand there now, in the ruins of such a castle, at the same hour before dawn, you might feel it, that quiet heartbeat, still pulsing in the stone, as if the cold itself remembers how long it took to become morning. The first light of morning in a medieval castle was not golden or warm. It was pale, hesitant, almost shy, the kind of light that seemed unsure of whether it should disturb the quiet it found. It slipped in slowly through the narrow windows, thin as thread, tracing the cold edges of the walls. It touched the stone floors like a hand testing the surface of frozen water. For a long while, it did not feel like morning at all, more like the last breath of night stretching itself thin before finally letting go. The fires, which had burned through the darkness, now stood in their final moments, a faint curl of smoke, a sigh of ash. The rooms smelled faintly of soot and damp wool. The servants began to stir, their movements slow, as though their bodies had grown stiff with the cold. The lord's hounds yawned, shuffling toward the door, their paws clicking softly against the flagstone. Even the air changed, still cold, but somehow lighter, as if the night's weight had been lifted piece by piece into the soft grey dawn. Those who had survived the night did not cheer the arrival of morning. They greeted it the way one greets an old companion, with quiet understanding. The first task was always the same: to wake the fires, to chase away the last traces of frost clinging to the window glass, to remind the castle that it was alive. Sparks caught slowly, as though reluctant to begin the day's labour again. Smoke rose lazily toward the rafters, carrying with it the smell of sleep and burnt wood. Outside, the frost still covered the courtyard, brittle and white. The stables were filled with the sound of gentle snorts, the stamping of hooves, the creak of frozen leather. The world looked both fragile and eternal, every branch, every stone dusted with the same thin light. For a moment, time felt paused. Even the birds, perched and waiting, seemed uncertain whether it was safe to sing yet. In those moments, as the castle exhaled the last of the night, something subtle happened. The walls seemed to soften. The heavy stillness that had ruled for hours began to dissolve. It was as if the cold itself had decided to step back, allowing life to return. The servant's breath no longer hung thick in the air. The faint hum of work, broom on stone, kettle on flame began to weave itself back into the rhythm of the morning. But for a few, the transition from night to day carried a kind of unease. Some swore that the castle always felt different in those first few minutes of light, as though something unseen was retreating into the shadows, watching quietly as the world woke. There were small signs, if one cared to look, footprints in the frost that ended at walls, candles burned lower than they should have been, the faint scent of smoke where no fire had been lit. It was as though the night left small reminders behind, just to prove it had really been there. One of the older maids, known for her sharp memory, used to say that the castle's walls dreamed differently in winter. She believed the stone itself remembered each long frozen night, that it carried the cold like a secret, hidden deep within, and when the morning came, it didn't forget what it had seen. It simply chose silence. She claimed that if you pressed your ear to the wall just after dawn, you could still hear the echo of the fire crackling. Even in rooms where no flame had burned for years, there was truth in her words, in a way. The stone did remember. It remembered the servants' whispers, the lord's weary sigh, the faint hums that filled the air to keep the silence from feeling too heavy. It remembered every winter, every frost, every dawn. The cold might have seemed cruel, but it had given the castle something precious, memory. And with memory came presence, a strange, enduring awareness that never fully slept. The lord, rising from his bed of furs, often paused at the window before calling for his breakfast. He would stand there for a while, gazing out, across the frozen landscape. Beyond the walls, the fields stretched endlessly, grey and silver, under the dim light. Smoke began to rise from the village chimneys in the distance, small curls of warmth against the cold sky. He knew that by noon, the illusion of peace would fade, the demands of the day, the noise of life would return. But in that fleeting moment, between night and morning, the world belonged entirely to stillness. Inside the castle, the servants moved quietly, their footsteps soft, their breaths shallow. They spoke little. The night had left them thoughtful. Perhaps it was because they had survived it again, another trial endured, another morning earned, or perhaps it was because they sensed that the night had not entirely gone, that somewhere, deep in the cracks of the stone, it lingered patient, waiting for its turn once more. A few of them, when they found a moment alone, would glance toward the darker corners of the hall, or the cold hearths that hadn't been relit. They said the air felt thicker there, as though the night still coiled gently in the quiet. No one feared it, exactly. It was simply part of the rhythm, the breathing in and out of winter itself. A slow exchange between light and dark, warmth and cold, life and its quieter shadow. As the morning grew stronger, the pale light softened, losing its sharpness. The frost on the windows began to melt, trickling down in thin, trembling lines. The first proper beams of sunlight touched the walls, revealing tiny patterns of dust floating in the air. They looked almost like ash, suspended and glowing. The castle, for all its heaviness, seemed to float for a moment, not in space, but in time, between centuries, between lives, caught in the gentle balance between what had passed and what would come again. And so, another day began, just as countless others had before. The rhythm of life resumed quiet, slow, inevitable. But if you listened closely, beneath the crackling of new fires and the shuffle of waking footsteps, there was still something else. A faint hum, perhaps, or the memory of a sigh. The castle itself, breathing, remembering, preparing for the next descent into night. Centuries later, when these walls would crumble and the fires would go out forever, travellers passing through the ruins would still feel it. In the first light of morning, when the air was cold and still, they would sense a kind of awareness in the stone, a quiet watching, an almost imperceptible warmth beneath the frost. Some would say it was imagination, others would say it was history. But perhaps it was simply the memory of that long, endless winter night that never quite ended. If you ever find yourself standing in such a place, the ruins of a castle, grey and quiet beneath the winter sky, try to listen, just for a moment. You might hear the faint rustle of straw, the sigh of distant wind through forgotten halls, the soft hum of a servant keeping herself awake through the hours before dawn. And when the pale light touches your face, you may feel what they once felt, that small, fragile victory of morning over the night. So, as this story fades, and the light finds you where you are now, maybe wrapped in warmth, maybe half asleep, let it remind you that every cold night in history has ended the same way, with the gentle persistence of dawn. Sleep well, traveller of time, and good night.